Hey guys, in this video we'll make a tier list of all tank classes for different types of content. We're going to have 4 categories: dungeons, trials, infinite archive, and beginner friendly. The balance between tank classes is currently in the best spot I've ever seen, and on top of that the scribing system has evened the ground even further. So keep in mind that a class I'm putting in the lowest tier isn't in as horrible a state as it was in my previous tank class tier list. Back then a bottom tier class was really tough to play. Now, a bottom tier class is simply worse than others, but not necessarily trash. Also, I am going to account for the incoming update 43 changes, which aren't that big, but are going to impact some placements. If you don't know what's coming, check out this video where I briefly go over the changes. First I want to quickly describe each class and list their strengths and weaknesses, because I'll be referring to them later on, when I place classes into categories. First we have Dragonknight. Defensive wise, they have access to additional armor and block mitigation, decent damage shields, a stamina restoring passive that makes stamina sustain trivial, and an ultimate that makes him immortal, in case a fight goes really bad. They can also use protective plates to greatly reduce damage taken from projectiles. They also provide the minor brutality buff, which will increase the group's weapon and spell damage, increasing everyone's damage and healing. They can also provide a group of major brutality and sorcery through igneous weapons, which your teammates can get through other ways, but getting it from igneous weapons allows them to make changes to their builds. For example, if they don't need to get major brutality from their potions, they can use heroism or tristat pots instead, and some classes need those to sustain. Offensively, they provide the stagger debuff, which increases enemies' damage taken, and engulfing flames, which increases flame damage taken. Next, arcanist. Defensive wise, they have access to absurdly high damage shields, tons of armor and recovery from passives, and an ability that heals you when you fall below 50% HP. This makes surviving so much easier because as long as you pay attention to your rune guard, you're safe. If your rune guard is up, then you're completely safe from smaller damage ticks. You can only die by not blocking some heavy attack. If your rune guard is not up, then your next action should be reapplying it. They can also help their group survive with the curative surge, a healing beam. This ability is kind of unreliable because of the desync, but if your allies are standing still, you can heal them for a lot, because its scaling is completely busted, so it heals for a lot even with tank stats. Offensively, they provide a unique 2200 armor debuff, and they can easily keep minor vulnerability and minor brittle with a single skill. Debuffs that can be accessed through different means, but it's a bit more difficult. Utility-wise, you have the Arcanist Gate, a portal that allows you to keep jumping between 2 positions. It's extremely unreliable on even slightly uneven ground, but there are fights where it can be useful. Next, a necromancer. The most unique tank class gameplay wise. Defensive wise, they have access to the best raw damage mitigation, at the cost of not having any class damage shields. The Spirit Guardian will constantly grant you a 10% damage reduction. The Disdain Harm passive will reduce your damage taken from dots by 15%. And it's actually extremely important, because the hardest content in the game is all about dots. Your main self-heal, Hungry Scythe, can reach massive numbers when used against multiple enemies. But it can also be unreliable, because you need to hit someone to heal yourself. So when you're repositioning, or when there's just no enemies next to you, you just lose access to your main healing tool. This is a big deal in some fights. Offensively, they have the access to the Glacial Colossus ultimate, which applies major vulnerability, increasing enemies' damage taken by 10%. This can be obtained from item sets, such as Turning Tide or Archdruid, but getting it from the Colossus allows you to replace these sets with other support sets. They also have the best ultimate generation out of all tank classes, thanks to necrotic potency, which allows them to drain ultimate out of corpses. Utility wise, they have access to the Reanimate ultimate, which instantly resurrects 3 allies. It can save a lot of time by preventing a wipe, for example when you're the last person alive, while also being under too much pressure to be able to resurrect anyone the normal way. Next, sorcerers. Defensive wise, they have access to a really strong damage shield that also heals them. On top of that, they have really strong direct heals, a passive that heals them each time they cast certain abilities, which keeps your health up even when you're just trying to apply debuffs. They can restore stamina with Dark Deal, and they have an ability that grants absurd amount of block mitigation for a short moment. Offensive wise, they can provide 1000 armor penetration with the crystal weapon ability, Major Berserk with their Achnak ultimate, which increases damage done by 10%, and they provide the unique Minor Prophecy buff, which provides 6% crit chance. Utility-wise, they have access to the Bolt Escape ability, which allows them to teleport across the battlefield, making them the most mobile tank class. Next we have Warden. Defensive-wise, they don't bring much for themselves, but they bring a lot to the group. They provide a unique minor toughness buff, which increases max HP by 10%, and they apply major resolve to the entire group. They gain increased armor from passives, they have access to a decent heal, Polar Wind, which can also heal your allies, and starting from the next patch, they will get 12% increased block mitigation from the Piercing Coat passive. Offensive-wise, they can easily apply minor vulnerability with the Fetcher ability, and they can keep up minor brittle in an AoE, thanks to innate increased chance to proc shield, and having abilities that have higher than normal base chance to proc shield. Utility-wise, they have access to Shimmering Shield, which allows them to absorb projectiles to generate additional ultimate, and they have access to Gates, which are traps that you can pre-place on the ground, which will pull enemies towards you when they step into them. They're extremely good in arenas, and in a few other places. Next up, Templars. Defensive-wise, they have access to a decent damage shield that scales with the number of enemies around you. Very good healing over time effects, which come with the drawback of being ground effects, which forces you into a stand your ground playstyle. But the issue is that some fights simply require movement. They also get increased block mitigation while standing in these ground effects I just mentioned. They do not have a reliable instant self-heal, as Honor the Dead can target other players if they're more wounded than you. Offensively, they provide the minor sorcery buff, which increases everyone's damage and healing. Utility-wise, they provide the Purify synergy, which cleanses all debuffs when used. And last, Nightblade. Defensive-wise, they have incredibly busted sustain, thanks to siphoning strikes. But that's pretty much where the good stuff ends. Their healing over time can be decent when a fight allows them to stand still, but as I said before, that doesn't happen often. Just like with Templar, their instant self-heal can randomly go on an ally if they're more wounded than you, making it extremely unreliable. Offensive-wise, they provide a unique minor savagery buff that increases crit chance by 6%, and they can provide minor vulnerability in an AoE, thanks to Lotus Fan. Now that we have the general idea of what each class brings to the table, let's place them on the tier list, within different categories. Starting off with dungeons. With fewer group members compared to trials, there's a smaller chance that another group member will provide the same buffs and debuffs you're providing, making them redundant. Which is why I'll be putting a lot of the classes in S tier, because they're all providing tons of useful stuff, as long as they're the only group member of that class, but also because I wanted to make a point of how good the balance between classes is at the moment. Dragonknight lands in the S tier. Their passive block mitigation and helping hands passive make direct damage fights easy to deal with, and the hardened armor damage shield can deal with damage over time. So they have an easy time tanking anything without a healer. And they can use Magma Shell to cheese some mechanics. They can provide the minor brutality buff, which is going to increase damage and healing of the group by a lot, if there is no other Dragonknight or Templar in the group. And they can apply Stagger to further increase the group's DPS. Arcanist also lands in S tier. With the ridiculous amount of raw stats that they get from their passives, the massive damage shield, and the Rune Guard, they can survive anything the dungeon bosses throw at them. They provide a unique 2200 armor penetration debuff, thanks to Runic Sunder, allowing damage dealers to shift some stuff in their build, like for example, changing some light armor pieces to medium. They also have much easier time providing minor vulnerability and minor brittle, and they can provide a quite strong runebreak synergy. If I was judging classes without any context, Arcanists would have to be at the very top, above other classes. But the context is that Arcanist damage dealers are also incredibly overpowered, so you'll be seeing lots of them in dungeons, and they usually have the bar space to take some responsibilities off of you. Necromancer also lands in S tier. The raw damage mitigation they have access to makes survival easy, and offensive-wise they simply generate tons of ultimate, allowing them to use more horns or colossuses. Sorcerer also lands in S tier. Hardened Ward will carry them through any fight, and offensively they provide the 6% crit buff, thanks to Exploitation passive, a 1000 armor penetration debuff, and they have access to the Achnak ultimate, which they can use when playing with a healer. Warden also lands in S tier. All the previously mentioned classes are better at increasing the group's DPS, but Warden shines when it comes to increasing the group's survivability. They can increase everyone's armor with Expansive Frostcloak, increase everyone's max HP with Minor Toughness, and heal people with Polar Wind. Templar is the first class that lands lower. Their playstyle revolves around standing your ground, and SOS has been adding a lot of fights that require constant movement, basically invalidating a lot of their kit. And not having a reliable instant self-heal doesn't help. Offensive-wise, they offer only minor sorcery, which can be pretty powerful, but is redundant if you have another Templar or Dragonknight in group. Nightblade lands even lower, in the B tier. Their defensive kit is just straight up weak, so with this class you'll have a much harder time simply surviving some of the hardest dungeon encounters. Offensive wise, they offer only minor savagery, which can be pretty good, but it's redundant if you have another nightblade or sorcerer in group. And that's it for dungeons. As I said before, the balance is pretty good and you can do any content with any class. You'll just have to put in more effort with nightblade. Now trials. I'm actually going to refer to stuff I said in the dungeons category a lot, so if you've skipped over that part, I'm sorry, but otherwise I would have to repeat myself constantly. Dragonknight, arcanist, necromancer and sorcerer all land in the S tier, as they all can be great choices depending on the rest of your team comp, and choosing the best one depends on the trial, so I can't really choose two best classes to use everywhere. Dragonknight's responsibilities can be taken over by a Dragonknight DD. You will usually have a support DPS Dragonknight wearing Zen and Alkosh, and they can use Stone Giants and Ignis weapons, but bringing a DK tank allows them to alleviate some skill slots. And it's also great if there's a fight that splits your group. For example, in Lucent Citadel, the first boss fight splits your team into two 6-man groups. So putting the DK tank and DK DPS in two different groups allows you to have Stone Giant and Ignis weapons in both. Arcanist's responsibilities also can be entirely taken care of by Arcanist DDs. And the Runic Sander isn't as useful because they won't be able to apply it to every ad, since they're not taking every ad. And this penetration simply won't be needed because of the Alkosh item set being present. But they shine at survival. They're simply the tankiest class and can easily survive even the hardest fights with no attention from the healers. Necromancer alleviates item set slots by providing a major vulnerability ultimate, while having insane ultimate generation. That, coupled with their insane damage mitigation, makes them deserve a spot in the S tier. Sorcerer can be extremely good if you do not have another sorcerer in the group. Major force can be taken care of by other supports, so you can spam the Yachanak ultimate, granting everyone major berserk. They also have an extremely easy time surviving, thanks to Hardened Ward being so overpowered. Wardens land one tier lower, in A tier, and it's not even their fault. Warden tanks are great, but the issue is that Warden healers are extremely overpowered. You will always want to have a Warden healer in your group, and you'll almost always have one. Recently I've been pugging trials quite a bit, and a lot of the times we had two Warden healers in the group, and almost everything a Warden tank could bring to the group is already being provided by a Warden healer, but they can still be good for providing AoE minor brittle. Templars land one tier lower, in B tier. They're good survival wise, a bit worse when the fight requires movement, but still okay. You can't really say that they provide minor sorcery, because there's absolutely no way that this buff isn't already being present. You'd have to be in a group without a single other Templar or Dragonknight, which will never happen in an organized group, and even in packs, it will be pretty rare. Compared to dungeons though, they provide the Purify synergy, which was already important in dungeons, but in trials it can make things easier for the Alkosh user, because it's a synergy that can be used by everyone, simultaneously, so it cannot be stolen by synergy spammers. Nightblades land even lower, in C tier. You can still survive pretty much any fight if you're skilled enough, but you'll have to work much harder compared to other classes. Offensive wise, they provide the minor savagery if there is no other nightblade or sorcerer, and they can apply minor vulnerability in an AoE. And that's it for trials. Next up we have Infinite Archive. It's a very specific place that we can't really compare to any other content in ESO, so the list will look quite a bit different. In the S plus tier, we have Dragonknight. And I'm making up this S plus tier in this category because I want to keep S empty, to show that there's a massive gap between DK and other classes, because of its access to the Magma Shell ultimate, which, thanks to some Infinite Archive visions, you can keep up at all times, making yourself immortal and allowing you to go really deep into the archive. The other classes just cannot compare here, no matter what. Next in the A tier, we have Nightblades. All of their weaknesses aside, they have access to the Mass Hysteria skill, which applies major cowardice in an AoE, reducing enemies' weapon damage by 430. The reason this is way more important here than in other places is that the Infinite Archive enemies have extremely low internal weapon and spell damage, with trash mobs being as low as 500 and bosses going up to 3000. You can severely reduce enemies' damage down thanks to this, and it's better than any other regular defensive tools other classes bring, aside from DK. One tier lower we have Necromancers. They also have access to AoE major cowardice, although this one is worse, because it's a constant effect on the ground with no duration, which means it cannot be extended by the extended favor vision. And keeping enemies within it can be troublesome, not to mention that it can be negated. Next up we have Warden. They can make very good use of gates and shimmering shield in the archive. They do not have access to major cowardice through just their skills, but they can get it from the Gardener of Seasons class item set, exclusive to Wardens. Though at that point it's probably better to rely on the single target major cowardice from your scrabbing chain, especially once you get at least one extended favor vision. Next we have Arcanists. Their defensive kit is very good in the archive, and also they can use the Arcanist gate to kite enemies, when you're at a point where damage becomes so insane you just can't stand and tank it. Sorcerer lands in the same tier for the same reasons. Decent defensive kit, full of damage shields, but also an extremely good mobility tool, Bolt Escape. You can easily kite enemies with it, once they start dealing too much damage. In the C tier we have Templar. Not exactly bad, the other classes just happen to have tools that are specifically good in the archive. DK with the Magma Shell, Nightblade and Necromancer with the AoE Major Cowardice, Warden with the Gates and Shimmering Shield, and Arcanist and Sorcerer with the Mobility which allows kiting. Templar's kit just doesn't work well in the archive, at least compared to other classes. And that's it for the Infinite Archive category. Let's move on to the last category. We'll look at which classes are best for beginners to start with. Dragonknight lands in the S tier. It's the most versatile tank class with access to both block mitigation for dealing with direct damage and damage shields for dealing with dots. On top of that, the Helping Hands passive makes it much easier to sustain blocking, and if you really screw up, you can use Magma Shell to give yourself time to recover. Arcanist also lands in the S tier. Tons of raw stats from passives, such as armor and recoveries, combined with the massive Impervious Rune Ward damage shield and the delayed heal from Rune Guard, make survival extremely easy. Sorcerer also lands in S tier. Hardened Ward being both a massive damage shield and a decent heal makes this class really easy to play. Warden lands in A tier. Their lack of damage shield makes them bad at dealing with dots, which is why I have to put them slightly lower. Necromancer also lands in A tier. While they have the tools to deal with any type of damage, they're not reactive. You need to already have all your buffs and heals over time running by the time the damage happens, which is why it won't be as easy to play for beginners, as for example DK, Arcanist or Sorcerer. Templar lands in B tier. I was hesitating here whether I should put them in A or B tier, and the thing that finally made me put them in B tier was the fact that their instant self-heal, Honor the Dead, is so unreliable because of its targeting. The last thing a beginner needs is an ability that straight up doesn't work if your teammates are taking unnecessary damage. Nightblade also lands in B tier. I was also hesitating here, but this time between B and C tier. Nightblade has the same issue with instant self-heal targeting, and on top of that, it has straight up worse survivability than Templar. But what made me put it in B tier is the Siphoning Strikes ability. It makes sustain absolutely trivial, and sustaining block is the number one thing new players usually struggle with. And that's it for this video. If you have any more questions, you can comment down below, or join our Discord server Wildheart. As always, feedback will be appreciated. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to my channel and check out my Twitch. Thanks for watching and see you next time.